second episode of Next Question Now. This is a live magazine style discussion where we bring passionate and thoughtful speakers together to talk about today's most timely, sometimes tough, and always interesting issues. My name is Leah Roundtree, and I'm extremely grateful to have the opportunity to facilitate this conversation, not only between our guests, but also with you, our community members and attendees. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize the amazing team at Peterson Capital who are supporting and presenting this series. They're driven to help investors understand macro trends and market context fueling Canada's economic future. I've really enjoyed working with them to put this series together, as we will share a passion for seeking out diverse opinions as well as bringing people together. I'd also like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to all of you who are guests attending this event. While this format does focus on the speakers and their ideas, I do encourage you to follow us and further the discussion on our various platforms. You can find Next Question Now groups on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and soon to be YouTube, where we plan to post all of these recorded sessions. And for today, I do encourage you to use your Q&A button to forward questions to me so that I can have those ready for the speakers. And you can start that at any time. And finally, let me say thank you to both of our speakers who volunteered their time to be here and spark this discussion today. Their biographies and experiences are very robust, and so I've only pulled out a few highlights on each of them. Firstly, I welcome Jeff Booth. Hi, Jeff.
Hey, Leah.
So Jeff is a very visionary leader who's lived at the forefront of technology change for 20 years. He led Build Direct, a technology company that aimed to simplify the building industry for nearly 2 decades through the dot-com meltdown, the 2008 financial crisis, and many waves of technological disruption. He's been featured in Forbes, TechCrunch, Inc.com, the Globe and Mail, BNN, Fast Company, Entrepreneur, Bloomberg, Time, and the Wall Street Journal. And it's his book, The Price of Tomorrow, that really is the basis for this event and this conversation today. So thank you so much for joining us, Jeff.
Thanks for having me.
And just before we jump in, I'll introduce Jock Finlayson. He's the Senior Policy Advisor at the Business Council of British Columbia. He directs Business Council's work on economic, fiscal, tax, environmental, regulatory, and human capital issues. He manages the Council's policy and research staff and oversees the organization's publications, presentations, and other outputs. He previously served as the Vice President of Research at the Business Council of Canada, which is a very successful and leading business association in Ottawa. So welcome, Jock. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for the invitation, Leah. Appreciate it.
Well, I'm really excited for this discussion. We have, I think, 100 people that have signed up to participate in this live, and I know that we'll have many thousands more watching the recordings afterwards. But how wonderful on a sunny Wednesday afternoon that we're here to talk about the economy. So our topic today is deflation the key to an abundant future, which is Jeff's tagline for his book. And Jeff, would you like to start off for the first few minutes, just start off with your thesis as to how you see this topic?
Sure. And I know this is hard to grasp because we measure everything through an inflationary monetary policy that is created that must grow forever. So all of our measurement is against that. The problem today is it's colliding with technology. So you have two different forces colliding against each other, and technology is moving on essentially exponential rails, trying to give us more for less. So increased productivity, that as things turn into information and information becomes free through a competitive environment. And that is the way that the world is kind of the free market would take all products pricing, and you essentially get more and more for less as your time expanded. That's why the world needs to be reordered to work, but it works the opposite direction today, where we have a credit-based society, and if you allow deflation into a credit-based society, the credit unwinds. It's impossible to pay back. So you have policymakers everywhere trying to fight that force, and it's becoming a bigger and bigger force in our lives. So the first kind of start of the fight is lower interest rates to try to drive growth over top of what's happening with deflation. And for 20, 30 years, you have a one-way ticket of interest rates moving to negative territory. And when that doesn't work, you essentially print money or monetary easing to try to drive inflation against that natural force. The problem is with that is it creates a very dystopian world as government becomes more and more of the market. So the government has to, and it's a structural problem, because as government tries to push up prices unnaturally, then a whole bunch of people that don't have assets, if you're renting, inflation is the same thing as wage deflation or your money losing value. It's really a hidden tax to allow government to spend more than they can bring in services or in revenue. So what ends up happening is that becomes a bigger and bigger part of policy, and it enriches some and it picks the pockets of others. And so that becomes the greatest fight of our time. And I would argue that every other conversation that's being had in the world today, from climate change to kind of woke and it's a derivative of this conversation. When you have misinformation and money is just a construct for our time, it's a trade of our time, and that can be manipulated, then you must, as a byproduct, have misinformation everywhere else. And so this force is a way greater force in our lives, and and some of us benefit from it. Some of us are losers from it, and that's causing the divide of society.
Okay, well, that's a fairly definitive opening statement. Thank you so much. Jock, would you like to respond to that and throw in a few ideas of your own?
Yeah, well, there's a lot that I could respond to in what Jeff said there, but let me just begin by highlighting a bit of an irony. We're sort of talking about deflation here on this program today, or at least that's kind of the top line theme. But as we sit here today in early August of 2021, we're actually looking at a world where we see generational highs of inflation in the United States, with key measures of consumer prices rising overall by close to 5% and a little above 3% here in Canada. So I think that's really been quite a surprise for people coming out of the pandemic, where inflation was extremely subdued over most of that pandemic period. And indeed, in the decades leading up to the pandemic, we got used to very low, stable inflation, sort of in the 2% range, both in the United States and Canada. And as Jeff noted, that was accompanied by really a secular decline in the cost of money and interest rates over a very, very long period. Looking sort of beyond the short-term turbulence associated with the pandemic and the attempts to get the economy to recover from it, I believe we should be fairly precise in our use of terms. So to me, as an economist, deflation is a generalized decline in the prices of goods and services. It's not a decline in the price of certain items like laptops or iPads. It's a decline in the overall price level for goods and services. Inflation is the opposite of that. Inflation means that the price level is climbing in aggregate over time. And there are two types of deflation. One is positive, one is negative. The negative kind comes about from a general decline in money and credit in the economy. So that can sort of starve actors of access to capital. The lubrication that we need for the sort of market economy to operate can be interfered with through a contraction of money and credit. That's not a desirable outcome in my view. On the other hand, deflation can also come about because we've become more productive. Productivity's gone up, technological innovation has accelerated, and Jeff talks about this, I think, a lot in his book. That kind of deflation actually has a lot of attractive qualities. It does mean that a dollar of income buys more because we have greater abundance. So I think we need to be distinguishing between those two types of deflation. I would just say, as an empirical matter, and then I'll turn it back to you, Leah and Jeff. We have not had deflation as economists measure across the Canadian or U.S. economies. We've had some disinflationary forces which have kept a lid on the price level and helped to create this world of low stable inflation prior to 2020. But we've not had outright deflation, that is a decline in the total price level over time. Now, the Japanese have had deflation for a long period. And some people wonder whether that might be the future that we're going to experience as well, and that might be worth debating. But empirically, we have not had economy-wide or broadly based deflation evident in the US and Canada as proxied by a drop in the total price level over time. But we've certainly had low inflation for a long, long period, which could trend into deflation depending on how things unfold.
No, sorry, go ahead. But just before we turn it back over to Jeff, Jock, I'll just ask my favorite question, which is, are there some of the statements that you do actually agree with Jeff on, and one of those being the potentially destructive nature if deflation happens because of the economic system that we have that is really structured for a growth environment?
Yeah, I mean, a powerful deflationary impulse, if it was to be sustained over time, would cause enormous ructions in our economy. So I certainly agree with that. And also technology, the speed and ubiquity of technological innovation, which is accelerating as we speak here today, that has acted as a very powerful disinflationary force in our market economies for quite some period of time, and it continues to do so. And Jeff raises the specter of technology-induced mass unemployment going forward. He's not the only one who has brought that issue to light. And that, I think, is one of the big unknowns as we look out over the next 5, 10, 15 years. Will this wave of technological innovation, driven by robotics and AI and the spread of digital tools and technologies and platforms, will it be different from previous generations of innovation? All of which ultimately led to growth in employment because you had, the economy adapted, you had new jobs created, new demands for goods and services that emerged, which soaked up the labor that was displaced from earlier waves of technological innovation. Will that happen this time? I don't know. I think it's an open question, frankly, whether the current sort of digital economy technology revolution leads to chronic kind of high and rising unemployment. It's certainly not the problem right now. Most of the business people on this call will recognize that companies are clamoring for labor in many, many industries today, but that's a short-term situation. It doesn't speak to the kind of structural changes that are reshaping the foundations of our economy.
Okay, thank you so much. We'll flip it over to Jeff, and if you can start by with where you and Jock agree on, and then jump into some of the other areas that might differ.
Yeah, and I think I think we agree on the structural changes coming to the economy. How fast those structural changes, how fast AI and robotics. I think everybody could look out, and I think a lot of people are delusional and think one day AI and robotics will show up, and it's a light switch to economies, and everything will be done by robots and human and artificial intelligence. And until that day, we're safe. We'll have lots of jobs. I categorically disagree with that. AI and robotics is already taking a whole bunch of jobs. And if you left to normal devices of a free market instead of monetary easing, you would already see the natural forces happening. You would see deflation. What Jock is talking about specifically on debt deflation and an unwind is you move from one system that must get rid of excesses of that, and you'd have a deflationary depression if governments allowed it. And that would be horrific as everything reprices to zero. Everything reprices. Governments would fail, banks would fail, you'd have to nationalize banks. And so you have two different systems operating exactly opposing directions. As a business owner, what would I do if my labor is going up? But people are voting with their time for less, getting more for less. I would remove labor with technology. And that would cause governments to print more money to try to stop it. And so what we're having, if you look at the data, it's when you can change the denominator, when you can change the base money supply at will with a keystroke, then you can create all sorts of types of inflation if you want to. If you create enough money, then that abundance in money will will create scarcity elsewhere, and that's what's happening. So this disinflationary force, why we haven't seen prices reduced in everything, is because over the last 20 years before COVID, there was $185 trillion as additional stimulus to economies to grow global GDP by about 40 trillion. So if it takes $4 of debt for every $1 of growth, you can tell something's not right. Now the question is, could you ever repay that debt? And what's happening in the economies is things become information becomes free. Look at Kodak as an example, but look at your phone. The phone is only 15 years old, and look at how much is on your phone for free. But Kodak used to have a supply chain for film. Every different region that you would go and buy film in, the developing, then you'd get a limited number of photos, find 2 of them that you like, and you would get scarcity in photos, and it cost a whole bunch of money. That cost of a whole bunch of money was our jobs to produce, to run that entire supply chain and that entire environment. Where does the abundance in photos show up in positive GDP today? And as information turns into free, the competitive nature of that drives prices down, and it's negative GDP. It's net, and if you could find new industries that grew faster than you were removing industries, potentially you could get overcome that. What I position in the book is, what you're doing, inflation is the opposite side of the coin of inflation, is wage deflation. You're forcing people into kind of their own debt trap as they lever up, and they're stuck into this model, trying to escape a model that their real wages are actually going down as prices, their savings are going down, because that's the other side of the coin of inflation. And yes, governments, because they can print a button, they can take 40 years of your labor and eradicate your savings by pressing a button and making up more money. But that obvious, if you have misinformation and money at the base layer, and money is just a trade of our time, then you can expect as a consequence everywhere to have misinformation. And so yes, I agree that if you print $5 trillion this year, lumber prices will rise by 3 times, and then they'll fall right back down, and that disinflation from the new point of them rising to the fall. So you have to continue printing money forever. If there's ever any slowdown in printing money, you'll tip into what Jock said. You're going to tip into a deflationary environment, and because you're delaying nature, you're delaying that from happening, and what companies will do in that is they'll remove labor faster. They have to.
Okay, I've got my first question coming in, and if it might inform Jock's response, and that is that you mentioned personal debt or savings levels that have decreased, but there was a COVID-driven trend of a decrease in personal debt and an increase in personal savings. I'm not sure if that's here to stay, if either of you have an opinion as to whether you think that trend would continue and how that might inform. So I'll put that question forth perhaps for while Jock responds.
Sure. Well, I think that's a great question, and it's a caution, I think, that we need to recognize we're in a very unusual period right now. We're still living through this COVID shock, which is the biggest shock to the economy, certainly in my lifetime, and it's had a lot of very peculiar consequences, one of which is it's pushed up the savings rate dramatically in both Canada and the United States. And is that a sustainable trend? No, it is not. The savings rate has been pushed up because people haven't been spending. I look at my own household. We haven't done any trips outside of Vancouver in the past 18 months. So we've obviously accumulated, we haven't been going to restaurants, we haven't been going to theaters, et cetera, et cetera. So savings rates have been inflated because the normal expenditure pattern's been interrupted. And also in the Canadian context, we've had hundreds of billions of dollars of government money thrown at the economy, particularly at households and workers. Here in BC, for example, over 1 million workers received the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, even though at the worst of the pandemic, the number of jobs that were lost was actually around 400,000. So it was a throwing jello at the wall kind of approach, partly in panic, I think, given the chaos at the time. So these are temporary disturbances to the sort of equilibrium level of savings, which were running much, much lower in Canada prior to the pandemic. Jeff is talking about deflation, but also inflation. I mean, he talks about money printing, almost raising the specter of what I would call hyperinflation, which we've seen in some jurisdictions historically. We've seen it in Venezuela. We've seen it in Argentina. We've seen it in Weimar, Germany, in the 1920s and early 1930s, where the value of a currency was destroyed through hyperinflationary policies, as well as shocks that hit those economies. That has not happened here. We have not had hyperinflation. In fact, in the 10 years before COVID hit, most central banks in the major capitalist economies couldn't even achieve the inflation targets they'd set from below. So inflation was actually trending below the 2% or 2.5% targets that most central banks had set. That is not the case today. Inflation has popped up coming out of COVID. Going forward, I don't see much risk of economy-wide deflation, at least in North America. And I think in the financial markets, the real debate taking place is whether we're moving to a new equilibrium for inflation. Whereas instead of sort of many, many years of inflation running around 2% a year, being quite stable, and inflation expectations well anchored around that sort of 2% range, that we may be now moving to a world of 3 or 4% inflation or even higher. And we could talk about why that might be. But if so, and my mind is not made up on this, to be candid, because I think there's sort of contrary indicators that one needs to look at. But there is a very vibrant debate taking place among sort of monetary policy gurus and economists as to whether inflation is going to move to a new sort of higher equilibrium level going forward, partly because of this monstrous buildup of debt that was underway, as Jeff points out in his book, well before COVID hit the world, but it's accelerated further. So we have built economies really on mountains of credit, both in the public sector, but also in the private sector. And that is not sustainable, certainly from a longer term perspective. Policymakers might be tempted to try and inflate our way out of that problem by reducing the real burden of nominal debt through inflation. And they could get away with it if they can fool the markets and engineer what I would call stealth inflation. And there's inflation that kind of creeps up and takes people by surprise. But if the inflation is perceived in the market in advance, then interest rates will adjust. And people borrowing money or rolling over debt will face higher rates. So I think there's going to be a real tussle out in the financial markets in the next 3 or 4 years as this kind of plays out, keeping an eye on the inflation outlook, but also on whether our policymakers are going to try and engineer higher inflation to help the economy manage through what I would describe as unsustainable levels of debt that have been taken on.
So I agree with Jock there. That is exactly what's happening. But this is the thing I would say that is to pay back the debt in cheaper terms. That is what policymakers are trying to do. There is no mathematical way to pay back the debt through a growing economy, because you'd have to increase taxes, and which would slow the economy to do that. And there's just combined with what's happening with technology. So they're choosing a different lever. Here's the thing that I don't think, here's the thing I would point out to Jock, and which I don't think has got enough light. I believe that the natural rate, and why interest rates aren't going up, is because the Fed will buy all the bonds to make sure they don't. They're pushing down the yields on the bonds, and interest rates will go more negative around the globe, because it's a structural problem, and they must. Because if they go up, you are going to hit into a deflationary spiral, because everything will stop. But what's happened is why when Jock says, when I'm looking at this system, a credit-based system that is bumping into technology moving the other way, these are opposing forces. And so one must offset that. And I think 30 years ago, if you actually looked at the natural rate, unmanipulated rate, not taking interest rates now down, not driving giant debt burdens that couldn't be repaid. If you looked at the natural rate of the economy, I bet you would have found a -1% deflation. But governments chose not to do that, and they chose to because it would have been too painful. So you kick the can down the road, you lower rates to try to grow out of that, causes debt burden to build up to try to grow out of that, always thinking they can grow up out of it. But what's happening on the natural rate as it's coming down is technology is moving more and more into our society in more and more things, is that -1% isn't -1% anymore. It's probably -3 or 4. And so when they weren't hitting 2%, their targets, it's because of that. And today, what you're seeing is, and people saying transitory inflation, which I agree with, they're not going to reach hyperinflation because of the same thing, because the other opposing side of the equation is moving the other way faster. And at some sort of level of printing where you could turn into hyperinflation, you could probably make that happen. But I don't know if you could if every country is doing the same thing, because they're all pegged to the US dollar and every country is doing the same thing. So, you're playing game theory in an internet connected world. That's not the risk. The risk is that by doing so, you're concentrating all power in government. And Jock, you probably know the answer to this right now, but how much of GDP in Canada this year and last year is government spending? And it was 46%. And so why savings go up is because there is no economy without government spending, and it has to continue.
So Jock, do you see that there's a crisis or an inflection point coming where governments would not be able to juggle their way out of it?
Well, I think it's an open question, frankly. I do worry about the track we're on today. I mean, I think the extraordinary challenges caused by COVID required an unusual response from our governmental authorities, both fiscal policymakers and the central banks. And so I'm not offering a critique of that. I think it was at a broad level, I think the responses were necessary. But when I hear the current federal government in Ottawa talk about the future, I do get quite concerned that they want to use the crisis associated with the pandemic as a sort of pathway for a dramatic expansion in the overall size and cost of government, and using that as a way to sort of insert government into every nook and cranny of our economy. That bothers me a lot. I think that will put us on a path not for deflation, but for growing sort of uncompetitiveness in Canada. So I think there's lots of risks associated with the extraordinary actions that governments have been taking, and central banks. When I hear central bankers talking about their role in combating climate change or racial inequality, those are important topics. They're not really within the remit of the mandates of central banks. And so central banks seem to be trying to take on more responsibility, widening the scope of what they feel they're responsible for. That bothers me as well. I don't think that's the right role for what are essentially technocratic institutions with narrow mandates. But back to the debt problem, I think that is the Achilles heel for the global economy as we come out of the pandemic. A lot of the growth we've seen globally has been fueled by credit. That was before 2020. It's accelerated since then. And it's not just government debt. We've got huge household debt burdens in many countries. We've got, in Canada, we've got way too much capital that's flowed into the housing sector. It's distorted the entire Canadian economy, in my view. In other countries, you've got heavily indebted corporate sectors and central banks, in a sense, have fueled this by engineering these incredibly low interest rates. It's amusing in a way to see central bankers, expressing concern about household debt and corporate debt levels. It's their own policies and actions that have actually created the environment in which this has occurred. So, but globally, there's too much debt. Absolutely agree with that. It's probably the biggest risk to the global outlook over the medium term, is that debts cannot be serviced. I think we could see a number of emerging markets getting into severe financial distress as we move into 2022, and they're unable to roll over the huge debts that they've taken on. I don't see that necessarily happening in the advanced economies, but we do need to get back to a world where we're managing our debt burdens down rather than clapping our hands loudly as they keep going up, which is where we have been until recently.
Yeah.
So I've got a question for both of you then, and that's coming from our audience. And so if you were to wave a magic wand and you had the power to do three things right now, whether it be from a government regulatory level within the central banks or legislative policy, or recommendations that individuals could do, what would you like to see happen? And I'll start with Jeff.
I've come to the conclusion that this trap we're in globally is unsolvable out of the existing system. So what Jock was just saying about central banks expanding their powers and governments expanding their powers, it's a structural issue, and they must, because they're fighting a force of technology that's moving the other way faster. So the expansion of powers, if they remove that stimulus from the market, we tip into deflation and everything resets. And so in their minds, so what would I do if I was Powell today? I don't know if anything different, because the existing system can't change it. But the problem with the existing system, and I'll get to a solution afterwards, but the problem with the existing system is it's pushing up prices unnaturally. A whole bunch of people are missing out on those prices. Their food prices are going up, their house prices are going up, and everything else. And other people with access to leverage and everything else are gaining out of that, which is causing a distortion in society and the social contract. As the free market is stolen and government spending moves in and enriches some people at the expense of others. When Jock mentioned a point there, inflation equals climate change. And so governments that are saying, I'm going to solve the climate, and remember, solar and a whole bunch of energies, clean energies, are coming down in price. And energy coming down in price, it being a first principle of everything else we build on top of. If energy is coming down in price, and solar specifically is getting 11% cheaper a year and becoming more and more of our global infrastructure, and it's starting off a really low base, that means additive energy that is clean, green, coming down in price, that must be offset to grow out of it by making prices go up. So the cause of all of these problems, the primary cause of the problems in the world that we're fighting over, is actually printing money to make prices go up in a system that must act the other way. And technology is going to solve this burden eventually, or consolidate all power in very few hands. And so what would I do with this is I would look to a system itself, just like, and why I use business examples is, it's very rare for a company like Netflix or Blockbuster with 9,000 stores to see a technology change that changes all the rules so differently than how they built their economy, their structure. They can't see it. So what they do is typically protect what they had. And so what's happening by not allowing creative destruction to happen in the free market, creative destruction is moving up to the monetary level. And what that means, what's happening right now is that creative destruction, I think, being led by Bitcoin, being Netflix, to Blockbuster being the monetary system that we've grown up in, is happening in real time before our eyes. But because the system can't change itself, like and if you ask yourself, what would Blockbuster do when a technology changed movie downloads to instantly, and they had 9,000 stores? They did what they could think of. They added candy aisles to their stores. What would a central bank do when a digital currency is putting power in individuals' hands that's outside the purview of the state, that is expanding an entire marketplace around, growing at the same rate as the internet? What would they do? And so what's happening is, what I would do if I was leader in Canada is I would encourage Bitcoin mining. I would encourage, I wouldn't signal to the world that I'm going all in on Bitcoin because it would cause the entire thing to collapse. But I would build a friendly ecosystem so more of my citizens could accumulate something that would be way more powerful in helping a transition to a different system. Because I think I think this is the, forget inflation and deflation for a moment, forget that conversation. Just ask this, does society require, is it a law that society requires money to lose value every year to run a productive society? And I think it's just a total falsehood. We believe in inflation. We believe that our money should be worth less every year to run a productive society. And I think that while that might have been true in the past, it isn't true in the future. With where we're moving to technology, a technology-driven world requires a currency that allows for deflation, a digitally native currency that allows for deflation. I think it's a requirement because every other path against that concentrates wealth and power in central planning.
Okay, Jock, do you have a response?
Well, my top three are much more modest than, and they're framed exclusively in the Canadian context, because frankly, the whole debate around inflation, deflation is more properly done at the global level. These global forces are going to shape the environment for how that plays out, much more so than what we do domestically. But what I would do for Canada, the first thing I would do is get off the track we're on right now. We are staggering and stumbling our way into basically a planned sort of quasi-socialist economy, in my view, in Canada right now. That is never articulated explicitly by the decision makers who are making the decisions that are pushing us down that path. But my analysis is that that's where we're headed. I think it's the wrong direction. And I don't believe it's going to deliver prosperity for our economy going forward. So I would sort of try and halt that and incrementally reverse it. Although I have to note that view is probably fairly unpopular these days in Canada. The second thing I would do is put entrepreneurs at the center of an innovative, prosperous, thriving economy. I think we've lost sight. I had a look at all the speeches given by Prime Minister Trudeau that I could find since he became Prime Minister. I don't recommend you spend your time doing that. The people on this call, it wasn't a very enjoyable exercise, but I found next to no content in his speeches that recognized, let alone championed, the central role of entrepreneurship in building a thriving, competitive, prosperous Canadian economy. And I think, I don't want to pick on him, I think that's true of the whole political class to a large extent in Canada. I think they really lost sight of the central role of entrepreneurs in a capitalist system. And we should be doing what we can to make Canada more appealing for productive entrepreneurial activity. And that requires a big change from, I think, the path we're on at the moment. Finally, I happen to agree with Jeff. I think there is a real risk this time around of rising unemployment, kind of structurally, triggered by accelerating exponential technological change, the rise of the digital economy, as some people call it. So I think it's quite urgent that we equip more of our population with the skills and aptitudes that will allow them to function and earn a living in the digital world. And I think, there are things underway in Canada that are helping us move in that direction, but I would sort of dial it up and make that a higher priority. So maybe Canada could become, one of the leading edge economies in adapting to the realities of a digital world. So that would be my sort of top three list, Leah.
Okay.
My wishful thinking list.
Okay, thank you. I've got a few just rapid fire questions because we're wrapping up to the end of it. But I'm curious, Jock, before we move on from Jeff's comments around creating like a friendly ecosystem for alternative currencies. I know that's a rather large topic to respond to in a rapid fire way, but could you give it your best shot?
Yeah, I think I'll give you my prediction. I think central banks and fiscal authorities are going to clamp down big time on cryptocurrencies. We're already seeing it in China. I believe that we will see a strong move in that direction in the next couple of years once we get out of this COVID crisis. It'll probably be done by creating central bank digital currencies. And indeed, there's work underway at the Bank of Canada and the European Central Bank in the UK and elsewhere where they're very well advanced actually in developing some of the parameters that we brought to bear to create so-called central bank digital currencies. Governments are not going to want to give up the benefits, the seigniorage rents that accrue from having a monopoly on legal tender in the market economy context. So I'm actually a skeptic in that respect that we're going to see a world where government issued and central bank issued currencies disappear into some sort of private sector cacophony of all sorts of different instruments. I know there are sort of libertarians who imagine that as the future. I'm very skeptical that we'll see that emerge. Governments have the tools and the authority to prevent that from happening, and I believe they will exercise those tools and authorities over the next couple of years.
So aside from whether you believe that they will allow it to happen, do you believe that they should?
I'm skeptical on it, to be candid. There's an awful lot of hype and promotion behind these cryptocurrencies. Let's face it, they are a manna from heaven for illicit, illegal criminal activity on a broad scale. A lot of the demand for these things is driven by people who want to escape the tax net or engaged in activity that's illicit. So I'm skeptical that we as a society are going to benefit a lot from allowing that to run. So in that respect, I'm a little bit old-fashioned. I'm kind of a small c conservative in my views about government. I'd like to see less government and more private sector, but not necessarily in the realm of money creation and transactions.
Well, I think we've now got a future topic for one of our next question nows. So we'll park that part of it to the side. Question for both of you, but let's start with Jeff. So does technology drive prices down everywhere, or are there many parts of the economy that resist that influence?
So it will drive prices down everywhere. Just ask yourself, without $185 trillion of credit creation in the last 20 years, how much would your house be worth? It's pretty easy to see. It wouldn't look like it does. That it's a manufactured designed price to drive prices up. The thing, I love Jock's views and everything else, but the thing I think that isn't being put together from these two systems clashing against each other is there is no free market on the path of government spending more and more, and they must spend more and more. It must move because the free market is moving the other way, and to try to so these are all structural issues, and so that monopoly of money, essentially, if you have abundance and money creation, you can create scarcity everywhere else. Whereas scarcity in money, along with technology and a free market, will create abundancy everywhere else. And so those are so what we're facing. It's not, and Jock is right here, and it's a global issue. What would China do if they know that the US is going to default in real terms on their bonds? Would China continue buying those bonds? Probably not. What would China do with their money? They would buy natural resources, rare earth mines, everything else, and control the infrastructure of where we're going. And so what you run into when you start manipulating policies around these globally, you run into geopolitical risk. And this is always reset throughout history. This typically takes 80 to 120 years, and you have a war that resets, and the winner of the war sets new policy, and it all starts again, and it feels good for a while. And it keeps repeating throughout history. And today we live in a history that is accelerated because of technology. And you can no longer hide the fact when you say, essentially, who gets to control manipulation of money to extract our time in our labor, when our labor is just a trade of our time for money. And we trust government in our best interest will manipulate that in our best interests. And once you have central planning doing that, it gets worse and worse and worse, predictably. But because of game theory of every country doing the same thing, it gets worse globally and global conflict arises. So what ends up happening as a result of that is you can see the signposts everywhere. You can see the signposts in Canada. And although Jock wants us to have a free market that's led by entrepreneurs, and I couldn't agree more, I'd love for that to happen because it would mean a productive society. But that cannot happen in this market because you're forcing prices up. When you force prices up, people go into real estate to hold their value, which takes more of the resources away from the free market. Those rents are going up, and most of the population is missing out on the gains. And a very small part of BlackRock just came in as a competitor in real estate to you and me, right? So pushing up those rents and everything else makes a lot of people miss out on that, and they can't afford to live. And then they vote for the same government to be able to redistribute money on their behalf, because government created the same problem in the first place. And it's a structural problem that can't be fixed from the system. I wish it could be, but it can't be. And it has to get worse because of that structural problem. So although I agree with Wave of Magic One, what I would like, small c conservative, I'm probably the same, but it can't happen out of a system that can't allow that to happen. It must get worse.
Okay, we'll give the last word to Jock here, and if incorporated in your wrap up, Jock.
Well, let me just turn to the question that I think your viewer or listener was asking around sort of inflation. Let me give you the three biggest components of the consumer price index, which is an attempt to gauge what's happening to the prices paid by households for a variety of goods and services. The three biggest pieces are food, shelter, and transportation. I would say that none of those three is likely to see downward pressure on the cost of living or prices over the next few years. If anything, we'll see even more increases, I think, in all three. So this leads directly into this growing kind of political concern in Canada about affordability. And let's be blunt, that's driving a lot of politics these days. There's a huge proportion of households that are really struggling with increases in the basic cost of living. And the three categories I just listed are where we're seeing a lot of that. So again, with those prices and costs going up, we're not going to see measured deflation in the total Canadian economy, although we will see it in pockets, traded goods, things we can import from lower wage jurisdictions, and products and services where technology is kind of revolutionizing the production process. Those are the areas we'll see prices go down. But the three big ones I just mentioned are largely impervious to that. So prices, I think, will continue to creep higher rather than lower in aggregate terms in the Canadian economy.
Well, thank you so much. I think we just in the last few moments, we've opened up another giant can of worms. I'm guessing that Jeff has some thoughts as to whether or not technology will drive prices down in those three areas. So what I will do as we wrap up is encourage our community and our attendees to follow both of you on social media. I know that Jeff in particular is particularly active on that topic on LinkedIn. I also do hope that everyone will join us to further this discussion on our various platforms, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And please do keep your eyes posted. We do have another fabulous speaker coming up next week and every Wednesday after that. Our next speaker is Faisal Al-Mutar, and he's talking about no more Syria, no more, how to avoid humanitarian crises in the future. So thank you so much for both of you for your time, to everyone who tuned in to listen to this show today. And we look forward to seeing the discussion continue.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you both.